Vermis Codicarius. The fighters flew low between ragged cloud and billowing smoke. Cinchian sigils glittered like false starlight along their wings, warp light crawling across corrupted hull plating. Snow was torn into swirling contrails as they punched through the cloud tops, engines flaring as they dipped into dense, snow-choked vapor. Missiles rose to meet them. One craft deployed twin lines of flares and peeled away in a spiraling dive, countermeasures blooming like burning petals. The second dropped even lower, skimming the cloud mass as tracer fire stitched the air ahead, flak batteries along the wall opening up in disciplined, overlapping fields of fire. More tracer reached for the attacker as it twisted through the firestorm, using the heat signatures of burning wreckage to confuse targeting augers and blind auspex locks. The pilot flew by instinct and omen, machine spirit and warp sign whispering through corrupted cogitators. The lone fighter dived. Twin lances of last fire slashed into the wall defenses, stitching destruction across gun emplacements and sensor towers. The pilot pulled up hard, rammed the throttle forward, and skimmed the fortress wall at killing height. Its payload fell. 2 bombs dropped. One slammed into the steel fortifications, tearing ferrocrete and playsteel apart in a roaring bloom of fire. The second detonated amid the gunners of a Hydra battery. The explosion mushroomed outward as ammunition cooked off in cascading sheets of plasma fire. Autocannon rounds detonated in their housings, missile racks ruptured, and burning crew were hurled across the battlements like broken icons. The fighter ran low across the ice, tracer fire from the remaining flak battery clawing after it. Quad-mounted autocannon rounds tore up the frozen ground, sending cultists and sigil-bound Astartes thralls diving into trenches cut deep into the permafrost. Others cheered the craft as it screamed back toward the valley heights, where more corrupted aircraft circled like carrion birds above a corpse-world battlefield, warhawks of the architect of fate, waiting for the next offering of fire and blood. On the ruined ground before the wall, Sorcerer Lord Sekhmet Azar ducked, scowling, as rounds snapped past him. He did not turn to watch the retreating fighter. He simply stared at the defenses, his heart a storm of fury and disbelief. He was infuriated. He had brought walls down before, many of them. Fortress monasteries with Astartes defenders had died in futility, their sacred relics entombed in armored vaults that became their tombs. Eldari moons with bastions of living bone had wilted beneath his gaze. Heretic citadels, Xenos redoubts, sanctified strongholds, how many defenses had crumbled at his approach? But this was a berm of worthless ice and stolen steel, defended by a handful of no-name renegade heretics of no consequence. They were backed by techno-barbarian tribesmen, worthless carrion folk wielding junk cannon and relic emplacements salvaged from wrecks not even the dying Imperium wanted. And worse, the demonic host aiding the defenders were Slaneshi. Not exactly known for defensive warfare, their usual hit-and-run excess, their ritual slaughter dances and ecstatic charges had been turned on their head. They were entrenched, holding ground, fighting like disciplined soldiers. It was obscene. The batteries on the wall continued to cast fire down on the assaulting forces. 2 minor Glyphsinger sorcerers stood nearby, deflecting incoming fire, some rounds screaming into the warp, others dissolving into clouds of prismatic vapor and burning sigil mist. Sekhmet Azar drew his robes tight and planted his staff, raising it like a shield, as heavy bombers now began their run on the weakened defenses. Tracer from the remaining quad cannon reached up, rounds shimmering as they struck the lead bomber's void shield. The shield flared, casting the shots into nothingness, until it failed. The cockpit was riddled with autocannon fire. The bomber lost height, skimmed the wall, and smashed into the mountainside beyond in a blossom of flame. Sekhmet Azar cursed again as the remaining bombers broke away. His head sank. This was intolerable. The battle had started too early. His forces were not in position when the enemy began the siege themselves. Who does that? A defender should be skulking in fear, not reaching out for battle the moment the enemy arrives. By all rights, the defenses should have fallen in the first assault, but those forces were gone. So was the second wave, and now his siege armor had vanished. So much for a meticulously planned invasion. He turned sharply on the nearby Vox officers. "Where is my armor?" The lead Vox priest snapped a salute. "Lord, Arch-charioteer Cheon has not reported in since he detached the hunter engines. Sekhmet Ajar hunched, closing his eyes for a moment. This was supposed to be simple. The Magister had assured him the raid would be easy. This rebel band of barbarians was meant to be a minor force, yet the fortress wall still stood, and by his estimation, barely a dozen Ember hands were defending it. Figures moved near where one of the bombs had fallen short. Warriors in sealskins and rusted plate tied to their chests and arms fired arrows at the assaulting troops, then retreated into the breached tunnel the blast had uncovered. Thulathi tribesmen. He had dismissed them as worthless. Some were using bows. Bows. In the 35th millennium. Who uses bows? He looked up just in time to see one of the glyphsingers stagger past him, then collapse into the snow. An arrow protruded from the sorcerer's throat. Damn them! A battle mage of the cult of Tzeentch felled by a weapon made by a caveman. This truly was intolerable. Sekhmet Azar grunted. He felt the weight of failure crash over him. Khatamet was gone, not destroyed, but no longer in the fight. Cheon was missing. He turned his gaze back to the wall, its outline obscured by heavy snow and rolling smoke. The wall was a ruin. Rents split its length. Whole sections had been torn open, bent inward, or reduced to twisted scrap. On paper, it should have been easy to breach. Instead, the wreckage had made it stronger. Defenders fought through the wall now, at every point where armor had failed. Shell holes had become flamethrower nests. Fallen gantries served as improvised pillboxes. The remaining bastions, perforated and half destroyed, were no easier to take than before, perhaps harder. Above it all, the demon-served cannon atop the wall continued to fire. Even some of the human-crewed guns still roared defiance. His own artillery, by contrast, was silent, scattered, or reduced to scrap. He knew the Iron Forge lay hidden within the city beyond the wall, but he also knew that even if they breached it, the city, built from the wreck of a starship buried beneath ice caverns, would become a slaughterhouse for his forces. This battle was not unfolding as intended in any measure of calculation or divination. For a brief moment, the sky cleared. He saw the support aircraft banking away, retreating toward the portal, out of reach of the enemy's air defenses. Then the snow returned, sealing the sky once more. Just like his mood, it darkened everything. Sekhmet Azar felt it before he understood it. A wave of thought rushed over him. For a moment, he was a boy again, seated with his brother by a pond near the acacia copse, beneath the pyramids of his homeworld. His teacher struck his staff against the sandy ground, knocking over the arcane glyph stones he had been teaching them. The boy looked up. "What lesson did you learn?" the teacher asked. The child stared into the glowing third eye of his master, then looked down at the glyph charms, stone tablets, each marked with an arcane sigil. It was his first lesson, the one all must understand. He picked up one stone. One side bore a device etched into its surface, a starship above a sun. The opposite side showed teeth devouring a world. He did not understand. "I do not know the meaning, master," he said. The teacher smiled, nodding. "Then you pass your first lesson." The vision vanished. The memory collapsed inward, leaving pain in his skull as his mind tried to fix itself back into the present. Thoughts washed into him like a tide, foreign, vast, and crushing. They were thoughts born of pure knowledge, unfiltered by flesh, unbounded by genetics or mortal limitation. Ideas formed by a mind without the biological predisposition to understand what it knew. The ground began to tremble, not with the rhythm of artillery or the grinding passage of armor, but with a deeper, irregular pulse, like a vast thing shifting its weight beneath the ice. The vibration climbed through his boots and into his bones. Then came the nausea. Power rolled over him in a choking wave. His vision blurred, colors bleeding at the edges as the air itself thickened. Warp pressure pressed against his thoughts, dragging at them, promising revelation and madness in equal measure. The Vermis Codicarius was drawing close. The snow ahead of the host began to rise. The creature emerged from the storm, dragging itself forward through the flurry with slow, inexorable inevitability. It was immense, a blasphemous fusion of flesh, scripture, and rusted metal. Segmented plates inscribed with writhing sigils ground against one another as it moved, every surface crawling with half-formed glyphs that rearranged themselves even as the eye tried to read them. Vast mandibles clacked and scraped, dripping frost and ichor, while clusters of blind, lidless eyes opened and closed across its bulk, each one reflecting fragments of forbidden knowledge. Scrolls, chains, and broken cogitator cores were fused into its flesh, dragged along its flanks like vestigial organs. With every movement, the air filled with whispers, half-heard sermons, corrupted catechisms, fragments of dead code, and the static hiss of data being devoured. Even the sigil-bound Astartes recoiled, stepping back in open disgust. Their corrupted discipline strained against the thing's presence. The Glyphsingers cried out, clutching their helms and temples, hastily erecting wards as their minds were assaulted by crawling revelation. Several fell to their knees, vomiting warp light and screaming as fragments of thought were torn from them. Only the rubric marines remained motionless. They stood apart in rigid silence, weapons held but unfired, dust-filled helms tracking the creature's passage with cold, ritual caution. Then the exalted host of Tchiel surged forward, laughing, weeping, shriek-praising. The cultists hurled themselves into the Vermis Codicarius's path. They cast aside their weapons and prostrated themselves before it, clawing at its plated bulk, begging to be crushed beneath its advance. The creature did not slow. Bodies burst beneath its weight. Bone and flesh were reduced to pulp, blood steaming against the ice. Some cultists were dragged screaming back by the more practically minded sigil-bound, who tore them free by the collar or crushed their skulls outright rather than allow such waste. Still, many died gladly. Sekmetazar staggered, then straightened. The nausea ebbed. The pressure became exhilaration. He had brought it to breach the defenses in the first assault. Bad timing had merely changed the sequence of the Ember Hand's fortress destruction. He laughed, long and loud, and pointed toward the shattered wall. "Breach it," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority and hunger. "The knowledge beyond the wall is yours to feast upon." The Vermis Codicarius turned, its vast bulk grinding toward the fortress. As it crawled forward, the remaining host fell in behind it, warriors, sorcerers, and madmen alike, following the living scripture toward the breach. The wall still stood, but not for long. Atop the wall, Ember Hand's Sergeant Sivar looked out at the creature emerging into his viewfinder. The cogitator flickered, and the servitor holding it began to shake uncontrollably before collapsing against the rampart wall, twitching and sparking. Sivar tore the rangefinder free, tossed it to the stone, and turned to Thane Valter. Valter nodded to himself. "My rounds are not going to pierce that abomination," he said. Sivar was surprised. He had expected the mere human tribesman to be filled with fear at the sight of it, but Valter only watched with cold, analytical eyes. He shook his head and added, almost thoughtfully, "No, I feel that thing requires more ordnance than I possess." Sivar turned to Yalaxa the Riband, her silver mask hiding any expression. "Will your daemon engines do anything?" Yalaxa tapped a claw against the wall. Far along the defenses, a cannon fired, a barrier of sound rolling outward toward the distant monstrosity. The Tzeentch cultists dancing before the creature were shredded instantly, torn apart in waves of sonic force. The Vermis Codicarius's armored plate split and peeled under the barrage. The creature turned. It opened its tooth-filled maw and belched sound back. The sonic wave slammed into the never-born manned cannon. Daemons were torn from reality as it struck. The weapon itself was ripped from its mountings, crashing from the wall top and tumbling into the depths below, its bronze pipes bending and shattering as it fell. Yalaxa nodded calmly. "Worth a try," she said beneath her silver mask. Sivar leaned against the parapet. "How did they summon such a demon?" Yalaxa ran a finger along her sword hilt, thinking. "They didn't summon it," she said quietly. "They grew it." Sivar frowned. Valter shrugged. Captain Moyle stepped onto the bastion top, hefting a crate of heavy bolter rounds for the weapon mounted on the wall's edge. "Looks like it's time to deal with it," he said, slamming the ammunition box into place and climbing onto the parapet. With a rush of hot air and flaring jets, Dagvar landed beside them, purple wings folding back into his jump pack. "Ah," he said cheerfully, "the bookworm finally arrived." Yalaxa turned her masked face toward Moyle. "My weapons will do nothing to its hide," she stated calmly. Sivar looked to the captains. "That thing will go through the gate. We can't stop it." Valter turned back to them. "I will place my guns on it. Perhaps a lucky round or mass fire could slow it." Don't be a fool, Yalaxa replied. It would take a battleship cannon to pierce its hide, and I do not see one here. Walter glanced along the defenses to where the heaviest macro cannon emplacement had once stood, now a twisted ruin from the bomber strike. No, he agreed, but perhaps precision fire. Waste your shells by all means, Yalaxa said coldly. Moyle slapped Dagvar on the back. Oh, come on, where's that fighting spirit? At least offer it a fine dance. He nodded toward the Vermis Codicarius. We know it's slow. Daemon cannons don't work on it, and it's sentient enough to react to stimulation. Yalaxa brushed the corpse-pale skin where Moyle's gauntlet had touched her, as if offended. I am intrigued as to the plan of action your tiny mind is currently attempting to brew. Moyle turned to Sevar. You defend the gate. When it's breached, that horde out there will pour inside. Don't play with them, just kill them. Sevar saluted and moved for the stairs, calling his Ember hands to him. To Walter, Moyle said, Put your guns on it. Even an elephant pauses to swat away flies. Then to Yalaxa, it seems to like eating your melodic chorus strings and organs. Feed it till it bursts, give it your orchestra's best work. Yalaxa bowed slightly. Oh, that I can do. She moved off with Walter to organize the remaining artillery. That left Dagvar waiting with an expectant grin, leaning on his axe, ready for the inevitable stupid part of Moyle's plan. Moyle grinned back. After it reaches the gate, let it breach it. The creature reacts to a sting, then sting it enough to make it follow you to the left of the gate along the old drainage culvert path. Dagvar frowned. That culvert was covered over. It's flat ground out there, just grates and rubble. I failed to see the ending. Moyle nodded. No, I expect you wouldn't. You never grew up in a sewer. Without further explanation, Moyle turned and descended the stairs. Dagvar watched him go, then nodded slowly. He sealed his helm and activated his vox. Second company, to flight. We have a bookworm to sting. He spread his wings and launched skyward on roaring jets of flame. The Ember hands followed him into the storm. Yalaxa's artillery opened up. The wall shook as batteries along the defenses fired in ritual sequence, not in crude salvo, but in layered orchestration. Sonic cannon, warp choir engines, demon-bound artillery, and corrupted macro emplacements, all discharging in cascading waves of force. The air became a cathedral of violence. Sound rolled outward in visible pressure fronts. Warp fire followed. Hexagrammic shells screamed through the storm. Empiric artillery detonated in blooms of impossible color, violet and gold and void black spirals collapsing in on themselves as they struck the advancing mass. The Vermis Codicarius did not stop. Its vast segmented bulk advanced through the storm of fire like a moving fortress, its scripture-plated body grinding forward with inexorable certainty. Sonic waves tore cultists apart around it, but the creature itself absorbed the assault with obscene indifference. Armor plates cracked, sigil-etched surfaces split and reformed. Glyphs burned, died, and rewrote themselves across its hide in crawling patterns of self-healing script. Every impact fed it. Knowledge screamed through the air. Fragments of data, memory, language, code, prayer, catechism, ritual, and raw thought were torn from the battlefield and drawn into it, absorbed into its living corpus like pages being devoured by a sentient book. It was not merely advancing. It was reading the war. Sorcerer Lord Sekhmet Azar stood upon the ruined ground and watched. Artillery thundered around him. Warp light washed across his robes. Daemons howled. Cultists screamed. Sigil-bound Astartes advanced in ritual formations. Rubric Marines marched in perfect silence behind them, bolt guns rising and falling with mechanical precision. And still the creature moved. The Vermis Codicarius advanced under fire, each step shaking the ice and stone, each movement accompanied by a chorus of whispering scripture and devoured data streams. Sekhmet Azar felt awe, not reverence, not worship, but recognition. This was not a beast. This was method. This was function. This was design given flesh. He turned, raising his staff, and his voice cut through the storm. Captains. The gathered commanders turned. Sorcerers, warlords, cult chiefs, sigil-bound champions, daemon engine overseers, and vox priests alike. His voice carried with warp-augmented authority. As soon as the wall is breached, take the city. The artillery thundered behind him as he spoke. No prisoners. There has been enough sacrifice on this field. I have no need of supplicants. No captives, no conversion rites, no preservation. Burn it, break it, consume it. The iron forge is the objective. The city is fuel. The captains bowed. Orders rippled outward through vox nets, cult hierarchies, warp signals, demon whispers, and ritual command chains. The host began to move. Warriors advanced in the wake of the Vermis Codicarius. Sorcerers followed in its shadow. Cultists poured forward like a living tide. Daemon engines rumbled into motion. Sigil-bound Astartes formed advancing wedges. Rubric Marines marched in lockstep, their dust-filled forms following the living scripture like acolytes behind a god. The battlefield reorganized around the creature. It became the axis of war. The bookworm's wake became a corridor of advance. Then, Sekhmet Azar's gaze fell, at the dead Glyphsinger. The sorcerer lay twisted in the snow, his wards still faintly glowing as they collapsed and faded. An arrow protruded from his throat. Simple wood, simple metal, primitive fletching. Crude. Impossible. A mockery. Sekhmet Azar stared at it. Then his eyes shifted to the tunnel. The breach where the bomb had fallen short. A ragged opening in the ice and stone, half buried in collapsed rubble and twisted piping. A dark, circular wound in the earth, leading downward into blackness. A sewer, a water conduit, some forgotten drainage artery from the buried starship city beneath the ice. A hole in the world, a vein. He looked from the battlefield, to the advancing Vermis Codicarius, to the burning wall, to the rising storm, then back to the tunnel. Curiosity stirred, not tactical curiosity, not strategic curiosity, but scholastic hunger, the kind that had once drawn him to forbidden libraries, to sealed vaults, to prescribed archives, to knowledge that promised madness. What mind had used bows in the 35th millennium? What culture lived beneath the city? What lay beneath the war? What knowledge moved below the battlefield instead of above it? The Vermis Codicarius would breach the wall. That outcome was now inevitable. But this was unknown, this was unscripted, this was not in the divinations, not in the Magister's assurances, not in the calculated futures, not in the predictive patterns. A hole in fate. Sekhmet Azar made his decision. Without ceremony, without announcement, without escort, without guard. He stepped away from the war. The battlefield thundered behind him. The god-beast advanced, the host surged forward. The siege entered its final phase. And Sorcerer Lord Sekhmet Azar turned his back on it all. He walked to the edge of the opening, stood for a moment, peering into the blackness. Cold air rose from below, wet, stale, ancient, stinking of rust, water, decay, and old machine filth. A buried artery of the dead city. A forgotten world beneath the war. Then he dropped. His robes vanished into the darkness. The storm swallowed the opening, and the war above continued. Unaware that its master had descended into something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than the siege itself. The Vermis Codicarius moved onward, not fast, not with urgency, not with rage, but with inevitability. Its colossal bulk ground forward through fire and ruin, scripture plates clashing and grinding as it advanced. Ice shattered beneath its weight. Stone split. Frozen earth buckled and collapsed. Each movement sent shockwaves through the battlefield, rippling through trenches, wreckage, and shattered fortifications. Eulaxa's artillery continued to hammer it. Warp choirs screamed, sonic cannon fired, daemon engines howled. Corrupted artillery roared in layered cadence. Empiric shells detonated against its hide in blossoms of color and distortion. And for the first time, the creature bled. Not blood, not ichor, but knowledge. Cracks split its armor, sigil plates fractured. Living glyphs peeled away from its body like burning parchment, unraveling into screaming data phantoms that dissolved into the air. Segments of scripture skin tore loose and collapsed into the snow, still twitching with half-formed symbols. The Vermis Codicarius slowed, only slightly, but it slowed, and Thane Valter saw it. He raised his arm. Mark the target. His mortal artillery opened fire. Heavy cannon thundered. Macro autocannons roared. Tribal siege guns and relic emplacements joined the barrage. Crude shells, mass drivers, scavenged macro rounds, and industrial demolition ordnance screamed across the battlefield. They struck the creature in brutal physical impact. Not warp. Not demon, not sorcery. Mass force, kinetic violence. The effect was immediate. Armor plates shattered, segments of its body ruptured. Entire sections of scripture flesh were torn away, exposing inner layers of writhing glyph mass and crawling data organisms. Mandibles cracked, sigil veins ruptured, Clusters of lidless eyes burst under the concussive force. The creature reeled, not in pain, in interruption. The pattern of its advance faltered. The flow of its living script destabilized. Walter shouted orders, his voice raw with command. Maximize fire! Concentrate impact zones! Target joint segments! Break its movement pattern! Do not disperse fire! Mortal gunners obeyed, batteries realigned, barrels overheated, servitors burned out, ammo stocks detonated in their housings. But the fire intensified. For the first time, the Vermis Codicarius reacted. It lifted its vast head, its mandibles spread, its scripture maw opened, and it screamed, not sound, not noise, not vibration, but consumption. A wave of devouring force erupted from its mouth, a spiraling vortex of data, warp pressure, and conceptual annihilation. The air collapsed inward as if space itself were being eaten. Ylaxa watched as her artillery died. One cannon vanished, not destroyed, not shattered, simply unmade, pulled into the screaming void of the creature's maw. Another daemon engine was torn apart mid-roar, its bound entities ripped screaming from reality. A third weapon fired once, then folded inward, crushed by invisible force, its daemons howling as their forms were torn into nothing. Her orchestra of war was being consumed, not destroyed, erased. One by one, her cannons were annihilated, dragged screaming into the monster's devouring mouth, their demonic spirits ripped apart and absorbed into the living scripture of the beast. Ylaxa stood in silence. Silver Mask turned toward the advancing god thing. Her fingers tightened on her sword hilt. Her artillery choir died around her. Daemon engines vanished. Never-born gunners were torn from existence. Her orchestral war became silence. But the mortal guns still fired. Thane Walter's batteries thundered on, crude, brutal, inelegant, but effective. Shells slammed into the creature's body, tearing more scripture flesh free, blasting open joints, rupturing sigil veins, shattering armor segments. The Vermis Codicarius advanced, slower now, still unstoppable, but no longer untouched. The battlefield had changed. It was no longer spectacle, no longer ritual, no longer prophecy. It was attrition. God-beast versus massed fire, living scripture versus industrial annihilation, knowledge versus kinetic violence, and the war had become a test of which could endure longer, the concept or the gun. The old sewer stank of rust, rot, and stagnant water. Sorcerer Lord Sekhmet Azar moved slowly through it, boots sending ripples across black, oil-slicked pools. The air was thick with decay and ancient machine filth, layered with something older, wet stone, mineral damp, and the sour metallic tang of buried infrastructure. For a moment, beneath it all, he smelled home. Hot dust, dry stone, sun-baked earth, resin from acacia bark, the faint sweetness of river water evaporating under twin suns. Prospero. The memory clung to him like a ghost. Bodies lay half-submerged in the water. Thulathi tribesmen. Some still clutched bows in dead hands, fingers locked around warped wood and crude fletching. Their sealskin cloaks floated around them like funeral shrouds. Rusted plates were bound to their chests with wire and cord, improvised armor for a war they had never truly understood. Among them lay a handful of sigil-bound thralls. Not many. Their armor was scorched, their wards burned out. Their sigil etchings were cracked and dead. They had followed the tribesmen down here and died for it. Sekhmet Azar followed the sewer deeper. The tunnel narrowed, the stonework grew older. Imperial construction gave way to something more ancient. Pre-imperial plating, starship alloy, void-hardened hull metal fused into the walls. This was no simple sewer. This was infrastructure, buried ship city anatomy. A collapsed section of ice and rusted metal blocked the passage ahead. Twisted piping, broken bulkhead plating, crushed conduits, frozen debris fused into a solid mass. Now he understood why the thralls had not pursued. The way was sealed. He placed a gauntleted hand against the wall. Cold. Dead. Silent. Nothing to see down here, nothing to learn, no knowledge, no revelation, no hidden archive, no forgotten vault, no buried truth, only rot, water, corpses, and stone. He exhaled slowly. He must return to the battle. Above him, far beyond the ice and stone, Vermis Codicarius lashed out in pain, and the psychic shockwave hit him, not as sound, not as sensation, but as memory. A wave of thought crashed through his mind. Suddenly he was a child again, beneath the leaves of an acacia tree, seated beside his twin brother, warm dust beneath their feet, sunlight filtering through green gold leaves. Their teacher stood before them, staff planted in the earth. Between them lay glowing tablets. The lesson was scrying, the seeing of futures, the reading of paths, the prediction of fate. Sekhmet Azar's slate glowed with shifting symbols. His brother's slate was blank. It was forbidden to look at another's slate. He looked anyway. The vision flared. A warrior in blue-gray armor, a wolf etched into his pauldron, an angel of death with fangs, a blade descending. His brother stood in the vision as a librarian, staff glowing with psychic light, and the warrior of Fenris cut him down. Chainsword teeth tore through him. Light shattered. Blood sprayed across the vision. Death. Sekhmet Azar gasped. The world burned. The acacia tree was aflame. His brother lay dead beside it. The pyramids of Prospero burned. The sky filled with warships, ships of Fenris. The tutor seized him, shouting, "Your vision is false. The warriors of Rus are our brothers. They would never turn a claw against us. They are loyal. They are kin." But Sekhmet Azar had seen, and he had understood. That was why his brother's slate had been blank. There was no future to read, no path to trace, no destiny to divine, because his brother would die. Here, to a wolf. The vision shattered. The sewer returned, cold, wet, dark, stinking. Sekhmet Azar stood alone in the tunnel, breath ragged. He felt the old anger rise again, ancient, buried, forgotten beneath centuries of war and sorcery, the rage of betrayal, the rage of loss, the rage of prophecy denied and fulfilled, the rage of a future that could not be changed. He had forgotten it in the long war, buried it beneath ambition, ritual, conquest, and knowledge, but it was still there, waiting, burning. With a snarl, he raised his staff. Psychic force erupted outward. Ice shattered, stone split, rusted metal screamed as it tore free from the wall. The collapse disintegrated under raw telekinetic force, ripped apart into floating debris and dust. The path opened. Blackness stretched onward. The sewer continued. And Sekhmet Azar walked on, not as a commander, not as a warlord, not as a siege master, but as a brother, as a seer, as a sorcerer who remembered, as a man walking into fate that had already been written. Sekhmet Azar walked on into the dark sewer. Above him, the sound of battle carried through cracking ice and stone, the distant thunder of artillery, the grinding impact of siege engines, the low, monstrous pressure of the Vermis Codicarius forcing its way through rock, steel, and frozen earth. He could feel it. Ripples of thought and knowledge passed through the stone like psychic tides. Waves of thought brushed his mind as the creature's vast consciousness moved above him, devouring information, memory, language, data. He raised his wards, shielding his mind from the monstrous intellect pressing against reality. And still he walked. Water splashed against his armor as he moved through the tunnel. The floor slicked beneath his boots. He slipped, catching himself against the wall, one gauntleted hand slamming into cold stone. He looked down. His hand rested on a symbol, a stone etching, carved into the tunnel wall by the builders of this passage, an artisan's mark, a signature left by a worker proud of his craft, someone who had shaped this tunnel with his hands and left his mark for no one to see for 20,000 years. Sekhmet Azar felt it, the moment of creation, the weight of the stone being set in place, the sound of chisel on rock, the quiet pride of labor, the small human satisfaction of making something that would endure. A creator who had died and been forgotten, but who had left this passage, this mark, this trace of existence. He drew his staff closer, bringing its light to the etching. He expected a name, a rune, a clan mark, a sigil. But it was not a name. Recognition struck him like a bolt around. The carving showed a starship above a sun, the ancient symbol of the Commonwealth of Man, the first human expansion empires, the old stellar migrations, pre-imperial humanity, the symbol of colonization, of departure, of worlds claimed, of mankind reaching for the stars. His breath caught. He had seen it before, the first glyph he had ever read. But how? Here, now. This deep, this far beneath the ice, the starship and the sun. But before he had seen it closing on a world, the jaws closing, the teeth devouring a planet, the same symbol, transformed, corrupted, evolved. His thoughts spiraled. Was this what he had seen all those years ago? Not prophecy, but memory. Not future, but past. Not omen, but history repeating itself. The same symbol, the same meaning, the same cycle. He left the mark behind and stepped back into the darkness. And now he smelled something. Not rust, not rot, not stagnant water, not decay. Promethium. Burned fuel, hot metal, smoke. industry. He heard voices, faint, distant, echoing through the tunnels, human voices. He moved forward into the blackness. The thud of battle continued above him. On the surface, the Vermis Codicarius reached the gate. Still under heavy fire, artillery thundered without pause, mortal cannon roared, tribal guns hammered, macro rounds screamed overhead. Heavy weapons spat tracer and fire in overlapping arcs. Shells detonated across the creature's scripture-plated hide, tearing loose burning fragments of living glyph flesh that tumbled into the snow like pages ripped from a burning book. It did not stop. It advanced through the storm, through fire, through noise, through death. The ground shook with every movement. The gatehouse trembled, the wall groaned, the ice beneath the foundations cracked and split. Sergeant Sevar turned, his voice cutting through the chaos. Fall back to the inner line." He seized a Thulathi cultist by the collar, an old man, half mad with terror and warp light, clutching a bow in shaking hands, and dragged him bodily toward the gatehouse. "Move," Sevar roared. "Move or die out there." Inside the gatehouse, 4 ogrins strained and bellowed as they hauled the old tarantula cannon from its mounting. The ancient weapon groaned as chains tightened, metal screaming against stone as they dragged it free of the embrasure. An Ember hand vaulted beside them, Vox Grill barking encouragement. "Come on, lads, few steps more, the lady's watching." The ogrins roared in response, muscles bulging, boots skidding on blood-slick stone as they dragged the massive weapon clear of the gatehouse. On the battlements, some of the defenders collapsed screaming. Men clawed at their heads, dropped their weapons, fell to their knees. The psychic pressure of the creature rolled over them like a tidal wave. A shaman at the gate staggered, trying to hold the closing charm in place. His wards flared, his eyes burned white. Then his soul was torn out of his body. Not killed, unmade. His body fell empty, collapsing like a discarded shell. The first impact hit. The reinforced gate shuddered. Runic braces cracked, sigil anchors failed, structural supports buckled. The entire gatehouse lurched as if struck by a falling mountain. Stone dust filled the air. Metal screamed, ice shattered. Sevar was grabbed from behind and hauled upright by Thane Valter, his head wrapped in bloodied bandages, face streaked with soot and ash. "The cannons are gone," Valter shouted over the thunder. Thulathi ordered from line. The Thulathi tribesmen moved forward, bows and las rifles raised with shaking hands, forming a ragged firing line before the shattered gate. Valter turned and bellowed at the ogrins. "Set the tarantula, now!" The ogrins slammed the massive cannon into position, locking it into place with brute force. "Prepare for close assault," Valter roared. The second impact hit. The gate bulged inward, metal warped, reinforcement struts snapped, runic braces collapsed. The structure howled under the pressure. Then, the final impact. The gate collapsed. Not opened, not broken, annihilated. The reinforced gatehouse detonated inward as the Vermis Codicarius breached it, scripture-plated bulk smashing through steel, stone, ice, and wards in a catastrophic explosion of debris. Blocks of ferrocrete hurled into the defenders. Metal shards scythed through the air. Ice fragments exploded like shrapnel. The gatehouse vanished in a storm of ruin. Defenders were thrown from their feet. Men were crushed. Ogrins staggered. Thulathi lines buckled. Ember hands braced. Sergeant Sevar raised his weapon through the storm of dust and falling stone. The creature loomed in the breach. Vast, monstrous, scripture armored, maw opening, glyphs burning, knowledge screaming. The gate was gone, the wall was broken, and the war crossed the threshold. Battle Captain Dagvar fell from the sky like a comet. Purple wings flared wide, jump pack engines screaming as he plunged toward the Vermis Codicarius, the storm tearing around him in spirals of ash, snow, and burning debris. His silhouette cut through the smoke like a falling god, axe held low, body angled in a killing dive. Behind him, second company followed, a full-winged descent. Ember hands screaming through the sky on jets of fire. They did not fire bolters. They did not form ranks. They hunted. Spears were hurled. Long-shafted war spears fitted with melta-bombs, demolition charges, and breach explosives streaked downward like meteors, their guidance runes burning as they locked onto the moving mass of the beast. They struck. Explosions blossomed across the Vermis Codicarius's hide. Not ritual blasts, not sorcerous detonations. Industrial violence. Melta-bursts burned through scripture plates. Demolition charges ruptured sigil veins. Explosive spears embedded themselves and detonated, ripping away layers of living glyph flesh in roaring blooms of fire and pressure. The creature reeled. For the first time, it reacted like a wounded thing, not like a god, not like a concept, but like an animal in pain. It twisted violently, vast bulk coiling and convulsing, its massive head snapping upward as it tried to bite the attackers from the sky. Its maw opened wide, rows of teeth unfolding in layered rings of bone, metal, and scripture. It snapped. Air collapsed. Reality bent. It caught an Ember hand in mid-flight. The warrior vanished into its jaws, armor crushed, ceramite shattered. Multiple rows of teeth shredded him, armor, flesh, and soul alike, grinding him into ruin as blood and burning fragments sprayed from the creature's mouth. Dagvar roared. He flew over the beast, not away. Over. He drove his spear downward with both hands. The weapon punched through the creature's hide, piercing deep into its living scripture body. The melta-charge detonated inside the wound. The explosion tore outward from within. The Vermis Codicarius screamed. Not sound, signal. A psychic shriek of rage, disruption, and pain rippled across the battlefield. The beast recoiled, turned, its vast body twisted away from the gate, away from the breach, away from the defenders, and began to move, not randomly, not blindly, but following the pain, following the stings, following the stimuli, following the source of its injury. Following Dagvar, Second Company kept attacking. More spears, more charges, more melta bursts. They did not try to kill it. They did not try to stop it. They guided it. They stung it, provoked it, redirected it, led it, like hunters steering a megafauna beast with fire and pain. The Vermis Codicarius turned fully from the gate. Its massive bulk shifted along the outer wall, grinding through towers, bastions, and battlements. Its movement clearing a path through the fortifications as it pursued the flying attackers. Stone collapsed, walls fell, defenses crumbled. The outer fortifications were obliterated in its wake, and the path into the city opened. Inside the ruined gate, Sergeant Sivar rose from the dust and smoke, Vox Grill screaming, "The beast is gone! But here comes the horde!" Thane Valter slammed a fist against the tarantula cannon mount and bellowed, "Fix your arrows!" The defenders turned. The breach filled with movement. A tide of bodies surged forward, Tzeentch cultists screaming praise. Sigil-bound chaos space marine thralls advancing in corrupted formations, sorceress banners, warp flames, daemon light, living scripture. They poured toward the open gate, into the breach, into the city. The god-beast had been drawn away, the wall had fallen, the gate was open, and now the true invasion began. Below the battlefield, Sekhmet Azar ducked beneath a partially collapsed roof brace, his cloak soaked in filthy water. His staff lumen lit the stinking channel in a prism of color as oil and promethium spread across the surface of the sewer like an iridescent skin. He grunted, adjusting his rebreather as the fumes grew increasingly foul. The voices ahead were louder now. He drew his bolt pistol with a thin smile, then stopped. His gaze dropped to the promethium film on the water. For a moment, calculation replaced instinct. He replaced the pistol and drew his sword instead. Above him, heavy thuds echoed through the roof as the battle raged on the surface. Dust and shards of ice fell from the ceiling, splashing into the black water. He looked up and saw that the roof was reinforced rocrete, smooth, uniform, industrial. It did not match the rest of the passage. This was not a natural tunnel. It was a covered culvert, a constructed artery, an engineered flow channel, buried infrastructure. He did not know why, but it made him uneasy, as if he were missing something important, some connection, some context, some truth just out of reach. He stepped forward, now almost wading through the tepid water. Thunder rolled above again. A massive icicle sheared free from the ceiling and crashed beside him, exploding in a spray of freezing water across his face. At the same moment, a wave of psychic resonance washed over him. The world shifted. The sun shone brightly through the leaves of the acacia tree. He was young again. Standing in the pond, his prelate robes soaked through, water lapping at his knees. His brother stood balanced on a hovering plate above him, pointing and laughing. Sekhmet Azar looked up at his brother's smiling face. He had lost concentration, not unusual in early training on the hover plates. That was why they practiced over the still blue water of the lake. The tutor stood at the edge with folded arms, his golden mask radiating silent disapproval. Sekhmet Azar reached up, grasped his brother's hand and pulled himself upright. Water rippled outward from where he stood. He looked down and saw the reflection of a vast starship hanging low over the pyramids. The water shimmered and the image split. Two visions flickered with each ripple. One was the ship in glory, painted red, silver tracery gleaming in the reflected light, clean and whole, majestic against the sky. Then, the same ship burning, the pyramids beyond choked in smoke. The sky filled with falling shapes, drop pods, fire trails, descent torches. War descending from the heavens. He looked up. Everything was still. Birds flew past, chirping softly. His brother still laughed. The world was whole, unbroken, untouched. Then darkness returned. The culvert roof blocked the sun. The sewer closed around him. The stink of oil and rot filled his rebreather. The water lapped at his armor. The echoes of battle thundered above. He stood alone in the buried artery of the dead city. Sekhmet Ajar tightened his grip on his staff and walked on. Ahead, he saw shapes he first took for blocks of fallen rocrete, untidy piles of rubble from the collapsed roof. But as he moved closer, his lumen revealed boxes, stacked haphazardly, some neatly arranged, others simply dropped in place. He could not read the runes stamped on their surfaces, but the warning sigils were universal, hazard markings recognized across the galaxy. A thought stirred at the back of his mind, a suspicion he had not allowed himself to consider. He placed his blade beneath the top hinge of one of the crates and lifted. The lid creaked open, loud, but drowned out by the distant thunder of the battle above. Inside, macro cannon detonators, sealed in waterproof casings. He opened another, the same. Each charge carried the yield of a melt-a-bomb. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he saw more. Piles of cylinders, not shells, not armor-piercing warheads, not the detachable saturation charges used in heavy artillery. These were propellant cases, the massive energy cartridges used to hurl multi-ton shells from the mouths of macro cannons. Moving forward, he saw drums of promethium, stacks of flamer recharge bottles, all full, some leaking, judging by the stench and the oily bloom spreading across the already toxic sewer water. Above him, the roof shook. On the battlefield overhead, the lumbering bulk of the Vermis Codicarius crawled across the surface, its mass grinding over ice and stone. "No," he whispered, then louder. "No!" Realization struck him like a blade. He ran, slipping in the water, wading through the stench, forcing his way toward the tunnel head. On the surface, the gate was gone. Hordes of the exalted host of Cheel, bandaged, blood-soaked, battle-worn, surged through the open breach. Veterans now, survivors of the first assaults against the wall. They poured into the city screaming their god's name, challenging the defenders to resist. Among them marched the giants. Sigil-bound thralls in Astartes armor, advancing in corrupted formations. Some wore Terminator plate, others bore ancient Cataphractii warplate. They crushed cultists beneath their feet as they advanced, weapons blasting, bodies falling in their wake. Behind the breach, Sergeant Sivar stood behind a barricade of crates and wrecked vehicles, the last pathetic wall of defense before the inner city gate. The final line. He raised his weapon. "Loose your bows," he roared. The few Ember hands opened fire with bolters. The Thulathi tribesmen, as battle-worn as their enemies, fired alongside them. Las rifles cracked, bolters thundered, men fell, blood sprayed, bodies collapsed into the mud and rubble. Thane Valter sat behind the last gun of the defense, the ancient tarantula. He looked through its iron gun sights at the charging horde. For a brief moment, a strange thought crossed his mind. They were barely distinguishable from the defenders. Bright colors on both sides were muted by mud and dried blood. Bandages wrapped broken limbs, sealant foam leaked from ruptured armor. Servos whined, pistons hissed. Both sides screamed for war. Both sides called on their gods. Between one man and another, one warrior and another, one human and one Astartes, it was no longer ideology, no longer doctrine, no longer belief. It was a brawl of madness, the same violence humanity had repeated since the first ape lifted a rock. Valter pulled back the arming pin and fired. The 4 long barrels of the tarantula thundered, a crushing crack-crack of twin dual cannons as heavy rounds tore into the compact mass of bodies. "Tharn Urath!" he bellowed. Beneath their feet, Moyle placed the last crate of arming charges onto the pile. He panted, drawing a breath through his rebreather, and looked down at the stacked ordnance. He swallowed hard. He knew it was madness, but it had always been madness. He turned to his men, the Thulathi, who had been unaware of the wider Imperium until only decades ago, and now stood planting the seeds of the end of their own world. Go. Get as far as you can. The warriors set down bottles of promethium and crates of explosives. They looked at him, uncertain, caught between obedience and fear. Then one by one they saluted. Moyle stiffened and returned the salute. There was no time for preparation, no time to rig lines, no time for ritual detonator arrays, no time for machine rights or layered triggers. This had to be done the old way. They ran. Boots splashed through filth, footsteps echoed down the tunnels. Bulkhead doors clanged shut behind them, sealing as they fled toward the inner city. Moyle smiled into the darkness. Not bad, he thought. Moyle, Mechanicus operator, interdiction, logistics. He looked at the tunnel behind him, ordnance stacked for 200 meters along the culvert. A Mechanicus solution. Not faith, not heroism, not prophecy. Logistics. Applied at scale. Interdiction through infrastructure. He lifted the detonator. A mechadendrite unfolded from his back, placing the cold metal device into his iron hand. Not bad for a gutter rat, he thought. Born in a sewer on a forge world hive city, as a boy he had held rats in his hands, belly rumbling, knowing that tonight he would sleep full. Now he stood in another sewer, not with a meal, but with a detonator. He nodded to himself and pulled the arming pin. No, the voice echoed through the tunnel. Moyle turned. A figure emerged from the darkness. He drew his pistol and cursed. The detonation had to be simultaneous, all at once. No staggered blasts, no partial ignition. He dropped the pistol and grabbed the plunger. From the pile of crates to his left, another figure rose, a man holding a glowing staff, a sorcerer, robes caked in filth and sewer soil. The man raised a hand. Psychic force slammed into Moyle. He was hurled into a pile of crates and a munitions drum. The drum burst on impact, corrosive fluid hissing across the warding runes of his armor, eating at the sigils and sealing glyphs. Moyle gasped, his rebreather torn free. Sekhmet Azar charged. Moyle threw himself into the water, one hand searching for the detonator. Another psychic blast smashed past him, crushing crates and spilling charges into the filth. Moyle rose, choking, spitting acidic sewer water from his mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. He raised the device, grabbed the plunger, rammed it down. No speeches, no vows, no last words, no remembrance, only action. Sekhmet Azar's hand slammed down, crushing Moyle's arm, bending his gauntlet armor, servos screaming. Moyle cried out. "You whelp," the sorcerer snarled. Moyle looked at the man's mask. "Whelp?" He punched him full in the face. Sekhmet Azar was flung backward, the detonator half-armed, landing in sacks of cordite. A crate of tank shells collapsed onto him, and he fell face-first into the water. His visor filled with substances no living thing should ever experience that close. He tore off his helm, spitting blood and broken teeth. He saw Moyle dive for the detonator and reached out, but his shattered fingers twitched uselessly. A blast of psychic force slammed into the water, throwing Moyle aside in a tidal surge, but leaving him alive. Sekhmet Azar scrambled, emitting a sound of desperation he had never believed himself capable of. He reached the cordite sacks, grasping for the detonator, a ward of unmaking forming on his lips. Moyle's fist slammed into his pauldron. The ornate gold scene, a relief depicting the victory at Uprenor, shattered. The sorcerer fell back into the sacks. Moyle was on him. Sekhmet Azar was a sorcerer lord, an exalted commander, a high scion of his legion, a chosen of his gene-father. But one thing he was not, was a brawler. Moyle was an Astartes, a heretic to the galaxy, yes, but born in the Underhive, raised in violence, forged in gutters and blood. Being alive meant brawling was a skill he had mastered. Blows rained down, they crashed into the water together. Sekhmet Azar raised his arm to block, and felt bone break. He could not believe it. He was Sekhmet Azar. The thought died as Moyle's iron hand smashed into his gorget. Ceramite cracked. Ribs shattered. One heart stopped. A lung collapsed. He fell back. Moyle looked at his augmetic, twisted, ruined, a mangled lump of metal. His mechadendrite snaked forward for the detonator. Sekhmet Azar forced himself upright through the pain, grabbed Moyle, and slammed him into the wall. He seized the detonator, wrenching it toward himself. Moyle's mechadendrite sparked as it fought him. They grappled, faces inches apart. Moyle smelled blood, ozone, sulfur. Sekhmet Azar smelled servo oil and sanctified machine unguent. Psychic power surged. He began pulling the device free. Welp, he spat again. Moyle grinned, sewer stench burning his lungs. Then he filled his Becher's gland and spat. Acid and bile splashed across the sorcerer's face. Flesh sizzled. Skin burned. Eyes screamed. Sekhmet Azar howled and released the device. Moyle grabbed it and slammed the plunger. The tunnel exploded. Brilliant light filled his burning vision. Sekhmet Azar opened his eyes. He could see. He looked around at the brilliantly lit space. No, not a tunnel. Grass and moss, the scent of a garden, rich flowers, living soil, but no insects, no buzzing, no life noise. A branch cracked. He turned his head. Bushes shifted. Probably a gazelle. He had seen them in the wild before. He raised a hand toward the canopy of the great tree where the sun shone brightly. No, not acacia. His mind raced through old teachings. Seba Pentandra. The name came unbidden. He had always loved the study of life. As a young psyker, he had been fascinated by simple things, shrubs, bushes, plants, creatures that were not mammalian, not reptilian, not even truly animal, yet still possessed a presence in the warp. All living things left an echo, the tall rainforest giants of countless worlds, even oak and willow on ancient Terra. They all bore a psychic shadow. Plants lived, breathed, moved, but on a timescale too slow for fast-born creatures like Homo sapiens to perceive. He looked around. This was not Prospero. He did not recognize this world. A growing world. Abundant. Living. The path ahead felt familiar, not because he had walked it before, but because the human mind recognizes patterns. He stood in a ruined city, towering spires overgrown with jungle growth, stone reclaimed by moss and vine, structures swallowed by roots. Nature had taken the bones of civilization and made them green again. The world breathed in peace and silence. Up ahead he saw his brother. He had fallen, perhaps tripped on a root. "You silly fool," Sekhmet Azar called, jogging forward. His red armor was clean. His power pack hissed softly in the jungle breeze. He knelt beside his brother as he stirred, already expecting the familiar blame. His brother always blamed him for every mistake. He looked up. At the end of the overgrown road stood a tree of white bone. It rose into the sky, its branches formed of gleaming ivory structures, its surface studded with multifaceted crystal growths that caught the light like stars. He had never seen anything so beautiful. Not even on Prospero. A cold wind blew, the trees creaked, leaves rustled. The sound was deafening, a sudden roar of nature where there had been silence before. Then he saw the sky, and something unthinkable filled it, something the mind could not comprehend in a single moment. The heavens were jaws, vast, world-spanning, a colossal mouth, formed of interlocking teeth the size of mountains, descending toward the planet. A cosmic predator, a god-devourer, a universe-eater. He grabbed his brother. They had to move. They had to escape. The teeth descended. Forests were crushed, mountains folded. The bone tree shattered as the colossal maw bit into the world itself. "We have to go," he shouted above the noise. He looked down. His brother's armor was no longer red. It was burnished orange. The face beneath the helm was Moyle's. The Astartes he had fought moments before. A mountain-sized tooth slammed into the earth. The moss-covered road was hurled into the air. The world broke. He clung to his brother and screamed into the storm, raising a broken arm as the falling mountain of flesh and bone crashed down upon him. Battle Captain Dagvar soared upward, riding the thermals rising from the burning defenses to conserve fuel. His purple wings cut through columns of smoke and ash, jump pack engines screaming as he climbed. Behind him, the Ember hands followed in formation, contrails of fire and exhaust tearing through the storm-choked sky. Below, the battlefield unfolded in ruin. The gate lay open, the enemy horde poured through it. Tzeentchian cultists spilled into the breach in their thousands, banners burning, warp light flickering across their bodies. Among them marched the sigil-bound thralls, corrupted Astartes advancing in heavy armor, their weapons blazing as they forced their way into the city. And beneath it all, the Vermis Codicarius moved. Its vast bulk coiled beneath the wall, segmented scripture plates grinding against one another, blind eyes opening and closing across its body as it turned upward, toward Dagvar, toward the sky, toward the hunters. Its maw opened, reality bent. Psychic pressure surged, the air thickened. Dagvar felt the pressure strike his mind like a physical blow. a rising psychic scream forming in the creature's core, a mind-destroying discharge building within its vast body. It was about to unleash. Then, the ground beneath it exploded, not cracked, not ruptured, not collapsed, detonated. The world beneath the Vermis Codicarius vanished in a white-hot flash of light, fire, pressure, and warp energy. The buried culvert ignited. The stacked macro cannon detonators went critical. The propellant cylinders chain reacted. The promethium drums ruptured. The flamer tanks ignited. The entire subterranean logistics artery became a city-killing bomb. A pillar of fire and pressure erupted upward. The sewer became a plasma vent. The culvert became a detonation shaft. The undercity became a weapon. The explosion tore through reality itself. Psychic energy and physical force merged, warp light and industrial fire combined. A hybrid annihilation shockwave surged upward into the Vermis Codicarius. The creature was obliterated, not wounded, not shattered, unmade. Its vast body was ripped apart mid-coil, scripture plates vaporized, sigil flesh atomized, warp structures collapsed, blind eyes detonated, mandibles disintegrated. Its psychic core ruptured in a burst of raw warp force that imploded inward as reality reasserted itself. The monster didn't fall, it ceased to exist. The psychic scream it had been forming detonated inside itself, folding its own essence into the blast. A god beast killed by logistics, by infrastructure, by buried industry, by human engineering, by a sewer. The shockwave surged outward. The breach became a furnace. The cultist horde was lifted into the air and vaporized. Bodies disintegrated. Armor turned to ash. Flesh became mist. Sigil-bound thralls were hurled skyward, torn apart mid-flight, armor ripped open, bodies flung in burning fragments across the battlefield. The gatehouse collapsed. The wall above the culvert failed. Stone, rokerite, and steel fell inward. The entire breach zone gave way as the ground was ripped out from beneath it. The wall fell into the explosion, collapsed downward, vanished into the firestorm. The battlefield became a cratered abyss of flame, smoke, warp light, and collapsing structures. Dagvar watched it all from the sky. A city-level detonation, a god beast erased, an invasion broken, a siege turned into annihilation. The shockwave slammed into the air around him, buffeting his wings, rocking his jump pack, throwing Ember hands out of formation as the pressure wave rippled across the sky. Below him, the battlefield was no longer a battlefield. It was a scar, a burning wound in the world, a cratered void where a gate, a wall, an army, and a god monster had stood moments before. Dagvar hovered in the ash-filled sky, silent, watching the firestorm roll outward, watching the smoke climb, watching the ruin settle. The Vermis Codicarius was gone. The breach was gone. The horde was gone. The wall was gone. The gate was gone. Only fire, collapse, and devastation remained. And in that moment, for the first time since the battle began, the sky went quiet. It was black, darkness. Thane Valter groaned. Light flooded his vision as a sheet of twisted metal was dragged away from above him. Sergeant Sivar leaned over and held out a gauntlet to the human tribesman. "You're alive," he said with a grin. Valter was hauled upright. The tarantula was somehow still intact, scorched, warped, and blackened, though its ammunition stores had clearly been consumed by fire. The rest of the defenses were total ruin. Warriors moved through the wreckage. Ember hands strode like giants among the rubble, hauling broken bodies free, pulling Thulathi tribesmen from crushed debris and shattered structures. The wall was gone. The defenses were broken. Valter sat on the scorched tracks of a ruined tank, wiped ash from his face, and rubbed his aching head as his hearing slowly returned. Dagvar landed heavily nearby, his purple wings scorched and smoking as his jump pack finally ran dry. His warriors landed around him, as battered as the ground defenders. Sivar and Dagvar locked vambraces, the grip of warriors who never expected to see one another again. "Moyle?" Dagvar asked. Sivar's smile faded. He shook his head. Dagvar nodded slowly, resting on his axe. "Damn," he muttered. "He still owed me 50 credits." Sivar snorted, shaking his head. "He will be remembered," said Valter quietly. Dagvar looked up the valley and nodded. "But not by us." They all turned their gaze skyward. The heart of the blast had cleared the snow flurries, revealing heavy bombers and fighters approaching in formation, bomb bay doors already opening. Valter leaned forward and spat ash from his mouth. "We've got no defenses left," he said. He grabbed a las rifle, checked the sight, and raised it toward the incoming bombers. Seaver picked up a rocket launcher, examined the bent barrel, and tossed it aside. He drew his pistol instead. Dagvar looked at them, then at his axe. He maglocked it to his back and picked up a bolter from a fallen Ember hand, leaving the apothecary to extract the warrior's gene seed. "Thank you, brother," he said quietly to the dead Astartes for the gift of his weapon. He cleared the breach, slammed a fresh clip into the bolter, and readied it. The bombers began their attack run. They could do nothing. It was over, except for the fighting. Then Dagvar's vox crackled. He raised a hand to his helm. Static. Then, Scout R1, do we take the fighters? Negative, Scout R2. 8 and 9, you take the fighters. Everyone else, target the bombers. Roger that, Scout R1. Beginning attack run. They watched as brightly painted fighters dropped out of the sun. Missiles and tracer fire crossed the sky. A blue-painted fighter tore across a bomber's hull. Its engines exploded, leaving a trail of smoke as it fell in a final, uncontrolled dive. Another bomber lost a wing to cannon fire from a yellow-painted interceptor, spiraling into the clouds. The Tzeentchian fighters tried to gain height, but each had a pursuer. Cannons ripped into them from the rear, wings sheared away, engines detonated, craft fell burning from the sky. Dagvar lowered the bolter. "Looks like Kadon decided to turn up," he said. Over the starport, where the Daemon warp gate still vomited cultists and ironclad Astartes, drop pods fell from the heavens, retro thrusters flaring as they slammed toward the battlefield. Dagvar hefted his axe. "That's enough lazing around? Don't you know there's a war on?" He turned and marched toward the place where the gate had once stood. "Ember hands on me." Moyle opened his eyes. The snow beneath him was cold. Good. He was alive. He tried to move. Every servo in his armor whined in protest, every muscle screaming in pain. He shifted to one side, pushing himself up on one arm. His broken iron hand hung uselessly at his side. Above him, fighters hunted fleeing bombers, contrails and tracer fire carving through the storm-choked sky as the last of the enemy air support tried to escape annihilation. Below in the valley, the wall was gone, a smoking ruin. Even from this distance, he could see Ember hands moving through the wreckage, living shapes in a field of ash and fire. He looked up the valley. Azure-clad warriors advanced toward the starport, climbing the slopes in disciplined formations. Drop pods continued to fall, retro thrusters flaring as they slammed into the battlefield. Around the warp portal, a vicious firefight burned with warp light and heavy weapons fire. The heat of the great explosion was fading. The clouds closed in again. Snow began to fall. For a moment through the haze, he thought he saw a lone shadow sword making its way along the valley floor. His vision was clearly failing, because he could have sworn he saw a daemonette sitting happily on the barrel of its volcano cannon, pointing directions to a sigil-bound thrall leaning out of the turret. He sat back as the snow thickened, obscuring the battlefield. He wondered how he was alive. He tried to stand. "Careful," said a voice. "The ground's slippery." Moyle turned. Behind him stood the sorcerer he had been fighting moments before, Sekhmet Ajar. His robes were filthy, his armor cracked and broken. His breathing was labored in the thin, cold air. "Thought I killed you," Moyle muttered. Sekhmet Azar nodded and coughed pink fluid into the snow. "Oh, I'm as surprised as you are," he said. Moyle checked for a weapon. He pulled his combat blade. The blade was snapped in half. He tossed the broken hilt into the snow. It slid over the edge of the ridge and vanished into the valley below. Sekhmet Azar held a handful of snow to his acid-burned face. "I could have fixed that for you," he said. Moyle shifted closer to him, nodding. "I wouldn't trust you with it." "No," the sorcerer said, clutching his shattered chest. "I wouldn't either." Moyle nodded and found a grenade on his belt. He pulled the pin, held the clasp. "Why am I alive?" he asked. Sekhmet Azar brushed snow from his hand and gathered another handful, pressing it to his burned face. "It appears our paths are meant to cross again," he said calmly. "Killing you would be technically impossible and socially impolite." Moyle nodded. "In that case," he said, "consider yourself a prisoner of Captain Moyle of the Ember Hands." Sekhmet Azar smiled through broken teeth. "I don't think either of us is in a position to make demands." The grenade pin lifted from the snow, floated, slid back into the weapon, locked in place, held by an invisible force. The sorcerer smiled again. Not comfortable with explosives, he asked. Moyle nodded. Yes, he said. I can see why you would be. Sekhmet Azar rested a hand on his chest. Tell me, Moyle. Not a local name. Moyle panted, shifting position, pulling a medpack from his belt. It's a long story. Sekhmet Azar listened to the distant thunder of battle rolling across the valley. I think, he said quietly, we have time.